Today, we're going to dive into everything about Steve Jobs. Hope you enjoy history has a strange way of picked its monsters and its saints. But in the spring of 1955, in a rapidly shifting post-war San Francisco, there were no monuments being built. There was only a boy named Stephen Paul Jobs, given away at birth, adopted by a blueprint-reading machinist and a modest accountant. He didn't grow up in an empire. He grew up in Silicon Valley before it even had its name, back when it was just an endless stretch of apricot orchards slowly being cut down to make room for military contractors, and raw, industrial silicon. Steve wasn't a product of privilege. He was a product of friction. He looked at the world not as a playground, but as a puzzle that had been poorly put together. At school, he was the ghost in the classroom. Too smart for the teachers, too detached for his peers. They called him a loner, an outcast, a troublemaker. But what they didn't see was the terrifying clarity with which he observed everything. And then the universe aligned. Enter Stephen Wozniak. Woz was older, gentle, a pure engineering savant who could make electronics dance just by humming to them. Steve Jobs didn't know how to solder a circuit board like Woz. He didn't know the raw physics of microchips. But Jobs had something far more dangerous. He could see the invisible thread connecting Woz's technical magic to the human soul. Imagine the year 1976. Los Altos, California. A dusty, cramped family garage. There are no venture capitalists here. There are no black turtlenecks yet. Just two kids, a bunch of stolen parts, and a vision that felt entirely delusional at the time. Wozniak wanted to build a machine to show off to his nerdy friends at the Homebrew Computer Club. Jobs looked at that primitive pile of wires and chips, the Apple I, and saw a revolution. He sold his only source of freedom, his beloved Volkswagen van, just to buy the parts. They weren't just building a computer. They were attempting to domesticate technology. Before Apple, computers were terrifying. Cold beasts locked inside corporate basements guarded by men in white lab coats. Jobs wanted to pull that power out of the basement and place it directly on a kitchen counter. This wasn't business. It was an act of pure, unadulterated rebellion. Success didn't just knock on Apple's door. It tore the house down. By 1980, the Apple II had turned a garage startup into a multi-million-dollar empire. At just 25 years old, Steve Jobs was worth over $100 million. His face was on the cover of Time magazine. He was the young king of the tech world, a rock star in a suit, redefining what it meant to be an American entrepreneur. But kings who believe their own myth are bound to bleed. Jobs became obsessed, not with money, but with a terrifying, borderline pathological pursuit of perfection. He didn't just want a computer that worked. He wanted a computer that was beautiful, even on the inside where no one would ever see it. He famously demanded that the circuit boards inside the Macintosh look like a piece of high art. He fired engineers over the curve of a plastic bezel. He screamed, he cried, he pushed people until they broke. To work with Jobs in the early 80s was to be caught in a reality distortion field, a psychological vortex where the impossible became mandatory, and your humanity was just collateral damage. The Macintosh launched in 1984 with a sonic boom, that legendary Super Bowl ad promising to smash Big Brother. It was a cultural masterpiece. But behind the curtain, the empire was fracturing. The Mac was beautiful, yes, but it was too slow, too expensive, and the market wasn't ready. Enter John Scully, the sugar water salesman Jobs had personally recruited from Pepsi with that famous manipulative line, "Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world?" Scully was a corporate creature. Jobs was an artist. And in the spring of 1985, the board of directors had to choose between the suit and the visionary. They chose the suit. In a closed-door boardroom coup, Steve Jobs was stripped of his operational power. The company he built, the company named after his favorite fruit, the company that held his entire identity, had locked him out of the building. At 30 years old, he was publicly humiliated, deeply rejected, and utterly alone in the kingdom he had created. The crucifixion was complete. What does a conqueror do when his sword is taken away? Most men would have retired to a mansion, counted their millions, and faded into the background of history. But Steve Jobs wasn't built for comfort. He was fueled by a dark, burning desire for vindication. This period, the late 80s and early 90s, is what historians call the wilderness years. But looking back, it wasn't a funeral. It was a crucible. Jobs took his money and founded Next, a computer company dedicated to building the ultimate machine for higher education. It was a commercial disaster. The computers were beautiful, jet-black cubes that cost $10,000, but nobody bought them. He was losing millions of his own wealth every single month. The tech industry laughed at him. They said he was washed up, a one-hit wonder whose ego had finally devoured his talent. But while Next was bleeding out, Jobs made a side bet. He bought a tiny, struggling computer graphics division from George Lucas for $5 million. He named it Pixar. Lucas thought it was just a hardware company. Jobs saw something else. He saw the future of storytelling. For a decade, Pixar nearly bankrupted Jobs. He poured his own fortune into keeping the lights on, trusting a group of misfit animators who wanted to make a movie about toys. And in 1995, Toy Story exploded into theaters, rewriting the laws of cinema forever. Suddenly, Jobs wasn't just a tech guy. He was an entertainment mogul. He had learned patience. He had learned how to let other geniuses, like John Lasseter and Ed Catmull, breathe and create without his suffocating micromanagement. Meanwhile, back in Cupertino, Apple was dying. Without Jobs, the company had lost its soul. They were weeks away from total bankruptcy. Desperate for a savior, Apple bought Next just to get its operating system. 11 years after he was thrown out of the building, Steve Jobs walked back through the front doors of Apple. The exile was over. The master had returned to his forge. The Steve Jobs who returned to Apple in 1997 was not the arrogant boy of the 80s. He was older, scarred, and infinitely more dangerous. He took the title of interim CEO, jokingly calling himself the ICEO, and immediately began a brutal, systematic purge of the company's bloated product line. He canceled 70% of Apple's projects in a matter of weeks. He drew a simple 2x2 grid on a whiteboard and said, "This is what we're making. 4 great products. Nothing else." Then came the partnership that would define the modern aesthetic of the world. Jobs discovered a quiet, soft-spoken British designer working in the back of Apple's design studio, Jony Ive. Together, they formed a symbiotic relationship that was almost telepathic. In 1998, they dropped the iMac. It wasn't a beige box. It was a translucent, candy-colored teardrop that screamed to be touched. It saved the company. But Jobs wasn't satisfied with just saving Apple. He wanted to colonize the entire cultural landscape. The iPod. 1,000 songs in your pocket. With a single wheel and a pair of white earbuds, Jobs didn't just sell a device. He broke the music industry's back and rebuilt it around the iTunes Store. And then, January 9, 2007, the Moscone Center in San Francisco. Jobs steps onto the stage in his iconic uniform. Blue jeans, a black St. Croix turtleneck, and New Balance sneakers. He looks frail, but his eyes possess an almost hypnotic power. He tells the crowd that Apple is introducing 3 revolutionary products: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. He repeats the list, over and over, until the audience realizes it's not 3 devices, it's one, the iPhone. With that single presentation, Jobs didn't just launch a phone. He launched a new era of human evolution. He put a supercomputer into the palms of billions of ordinary people, fundamentally altering the way humanity communicates, thinks, and experiences reality. Apple wasn't just a company anymore. It was the wealthiest, most influential empire on the planet. The ultimate tragedy of Steve Jobs is that the moment he achieved absolute dominance over the world, his own body turned against him. In 2004, he was diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer. He fought it with the same stubborn defiance he used against IBM and Scully. He tried alternative medicine. He denied reality. He used his distortion field on his own diagnosis. But biology doesn't care about vision. By the late 2000s, the world watched him visibly wasting away on stage. The vibrant tech mogul was turning into a ghost right before our eyes. His skin clung tightly to his cheekbones. His clothes hung loosely on his frail frame. But even as his body crumbled, his focus grew sharper, almost terrifyingly cold. In 2005, he stood before the graduating class at Stanford University and delivered what would become his own eulogy. He told those young kids, "Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important." He spent his final years in a race against the clock. He oversaw the launch of the iPad, completing his life stream of the ultimate invisible computer. He spent his remaining days at home in Palo Alto, surrounded by his wife Lorene and his children, planning the architecture of Apple's future corporate campus, a perfect, giant circle resembling a spaceship landed in California. On October 5, 2011, the screen went black. Steve Jobs took his final breath. His last words, whispered as he looked over the shoulders of his family into the distance, were simply, "Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Was he a good man? Ask the engineers he broke, the daughter he initially denied, or the friends he betrayed, and they will tell you he could be a tyrant. He was flawed, cruel, and deeply broken in ways that money could never fix. But if you measure a life by the dent it leaves on the universe, Steve Jobs stands alone. He didn't just invent devices, he engineered the modern world. He showed us that genius isn't about being nice, it's about an unyielding, fanatical refusal to accept the world as it is. The boy from the garage is gone. But the world he imagined is the world we are all living in right now. That's all from Mango. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.